This is a Brookings Institution podcast on the 2013 State of the Union Address, with commentary and analysis from Brookings experts Tom Mann, Sarah Binder, Bill Galston, and Ron Haskins.
Good morning, colleagues.
Morning,
Bill
Tom.
Galston, my colleague in governmental studies. Ron Haskins, colleague in economic studies. Sarah Binder.
Hi, Tom.
Welcome. I'm Tom Mann in governmental studies. We're 2 weeks into Barack Obama's second term, days before his State of the Union speech. An initial question we want to wrestle with is what in the world our State of the Union speeches for? What difference do they make? Why do we have them? What are we looking for? And do we think anything Barack Obama says at the State of the Union will make any difference for politics and policymaking over the year ahead? Who would like to jump in? Bill?
Well, State of the Union addresses, seems to me, have two principal functions, one internal and the other external. Internally, the preparation for the State of the Union address is an opportunity for every piece of the government to formulate its wish list and to forward said list to the White House. And in my experience, an extended period of culling and debate then ensues, and the State of the Union address is shaped in very much the same way a piece of sculpture emerges from a block of marble, through subtraction. You chip away at what you don't want, and eventually what you do want is left. And departments and agencies will fight very hard for their sentence or two in the State of the Union address, because that's the hook on which they can hang their legislative and administrative agendas, even if it's mentioned. Externally, of course, a lot of people read the State of the Union and listen to it as a leading indicator of what the administration's real priorities are likely to be for the next year. That's a little bit harder to do if a State of the Union is a laundry list, which it frequently is, as opposed to a somewhat more parsimonious recounting of the administration's top priorities.
You know, I would add to that, the first State of the Union, or the first of the second term, might be a little bit more important than a regular State of the Union, and especially in this case, because Obama won a resounding victory under very difficult circumstances. Basically, Democrats trounced Republicans. Republicans have had a great deal of soul-searching. And I've seen a lot of speculation in the press and on the blogs and on TV about this is a real historic opportunity for Obama. He's already obviously a historic president. But if he could really do something with an agenda that involved immigration and probably gun control and something about the debt, then it would really be historic. It would establish him perhaps as a great president. Now, all three of these issues are going to be extremely difficult. I am certainly not predicting, and there are good reasons why he would not want to lay out his agenda in a State of the Union. But I think he should, and I think he will discuss all three of those issues, although he'll be short in his discussion on the debt because he hasn't done anything yet, and I don't think he plans to do very much.
Ron, it's really interesting because you're focusing on a handful of priorities the president should lay out for the next year in his second term. But Bill described an internal process that would seem to lead to a laundry list of items. And I seem to remember State of the Union speeches being very much laundry list of items. What accounts for the clash between those two? Sarah Binder?
Well, I think, Tom, Bill really sort of laid it out, which is that the differences between, from agencies' perspective, about the opportunities that arise from how the president go out in front of the country and lay out an agenda, you want to make sure that you're in on the laundry list. Of course, for those of us listening from home, I have to admit, it's been a long time since I've made it past the first 20, 30 minutes before I'm flat out asleep on the couch because the laundry list. I can't bear the laundry list.
It's the wine.
No, I don't even drink, though the laundry list would lead me to drink. I don't know. So, but I agree with Ron that a great speech, and perhaps the State of the Union is not the right context, right? Perhaps that's not the context in which he does it. But to lay out top 3 priorities, make the case for them, make the case beyond members of Congress, because as President Obama has learned, right, anytime he embraces something, the Republicans take the opposite side, and so he really needs to build a broader constituency. Right. That's tough to do on a laundry list, but if you isolated immigration reform, maybe deficits, maybe not, but and the other issues, well, maybe he'd have a chance of actually making some progress. And he doesn't have a lot of time.
The problem with laying out an agenda, of course, and especially if you lay out a laundry list, nobody remembers anything and you can't do everything and so forth. But if you lay out just a few and say this and make it, these are important to the future of the country and these are the 3 or 4 things or even 2 that I'm going to do, then people will remember that and you really could be judged on it. And the issues are so difficult that I think you'd have to go in thinking it's unlikely to do it. But let me point out one thing that I think is really important. Republicans are on the run. And I think they are having serious second thoughts. They were more than reasonable on the debt ceiling, which was quite surprising. And I think the speeches by Rubio and Ryan about poverty and about opportunity in America were really indicators that leaders in the Republican Party want to step up to the plate on issues that they've been perhaps a little negligent on. So this might be an opportunity the Republicans really would cut a deal. On immigration, for example, they have lots of electoral reasons for doing something about immigration and for not appearing to be recalcitrant about even issues of what we're going to do about 11 million undocumented workers. And furthermore, it would engender a war within the Republican Party. So I think there are reasons for Obama to really step forward with an agenda and say this is what we're going to do, and let's get at it.
Do you think we got a preview of that in his inaugural address? And might the State of the Union be a matter of sort of fleshing out 3 or 4 specific items? But I saw that address as really a remembrance of the Declaration of Independence and the guarantees, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a statement about the importance of government, really a progressive vision for the country, a belief that the government has to assume some responsibilities if we're going to move along. Does that pretty much tell us that, for example, he's not going to be devoting all of his energy and attention to a grand bargain so that we talk about deficits and debt as we have over the last couple of years?
Well, I do think that Obama's second inaugural address was, I think, an excellent portrait of where his head is and where his coalition is. And for him and for that coalition, this is a grand drama of social inclusion and equalization. And there's a lot to be said for that. What struck me about the second inaugural, and I hope it doesn't continue to strike me after the State of the Union address, is that the imperative of robust economic growth was conspicuous by its absence. We have been enduring a very weak recovery from a very deep recession. We are still millions of jobs short of where we were 6 years ago. Household incomes are down 7% across the board from where they were at their peak, and they're flatlining. They're not rising. So we have a recovery that is really not doing what the economy is supposed to be doing for Americans who are trying to rise. And American politics gets very ugly if it's conducted in a zero-sum economic framework and a zero-sum fiscal framework. But that's where we are right now. And so I'm going to be listening very carefully to see whether the president takes on the burden of trying to move us onto a higher economic growth path, and if so, what kinds of policies he intends to back. We used to have two political parties arguing about the best way to promote economic growth. Now it seems to me that we have one party talking about social inclusion and equality and the other one talking about spending reduction, and nobody is talking about economic growth, and this is amazing to me.
I heard a different inaugural in many respects. That is to say, I thought the focus on sort of jobs and infrastructure investments and building a vibrant economy with relatively little attention to cutting government spending now was implicitly, perhaps not explicitly, a case to shift the attention away from a constant focus on deficits and spending cuts and a sort of clarion call for government doing what it needs to do to try to increase economic growth in the short term and over the long term.
Well, I don't think that most people who listened to and wrote about the speech came away with that as what might be called the long pole in the speech's tent. The narrative was much less about growth and much more about inclusion and social equality. And we need both.
Yeah.
We need both. And the question is, and the State of the Union may begin to answer this question, whether the kinds of specificity of policy with which the president has approached issues of equality and social inclusion will be matched by the specificity of policy in the area of economic growth, and whether the scope of the remedies that he outlines will be equal to the scope of the problem. It seems to me that mismatch has been central in our politics for quite some time now.
That sounds right. So can we talk about that? What are those policies?
It strikes me as, that's what I was going to say. It strikes me as very dangerous for him to do this. I agree with everything Bill says. But what's left to try? I mean, we've tried so many things. We've tried to stimulate the economy. I still have the, I guess, outdated view that we're spending $1 trillion more every year than we take in. That strikes me as Keynesian. And nothing we've done has worked very well in the short term. Now, Obama wisely, I think, has done things that hold promise in the long term. I think his education agenda has been remarkable in many ways. I think Race to the Top has really achieved some changes out in the states that make a big difference, and a focus on teachers and a focus on quality teaching and evaluation of student learning being part of the assessment of teachers. But those are not things that are going to turn around right away. And another stimulus certainly would not make it through the House. So, what exactly should the president propose to stimulate the economy?
I'm not talking about another stimulus, right? I'm talking about the kinds of investments that actually produce a higher growth path. If the president gets as serious, for example, about major new infrastructure investments as he is about immigration reform, we might actually see them.
Although immigration reform in and of itself, if done well, could contribute more to economic growth than almost any other policy that we might take on. But Bill, I agree with you on the investment side of it, but But, there is this other Keynesian observation that much of Europe is substantially behind us in levels of growth and in unemployment rates, and the evidence on cutting spending and reducing deficits in the short term is not very encouraging as a policy approach to promoting economic growth. In fact, the latest official reports that came out said that government activity is now a net negative on growth. We are holding growth back rather than contributing to it. So I don't think it's a matter of we tried things and they don't work. We tried something for a little while, it ran out, and now the negative part just continues.
Well, I'm struck. So I spent a little time this morning at home, opened up the Wall Street Journal, the paper version, for a nice treat rather than reading online, ruining my eyes. And there's this article, I don't know if you saw it, about Republican states. First of all, the spread of Republican-controlled states at both governorships and state level, and looking at what's going on in Kansas. And I was struck, first of all, that the solution for them is tax reform, essentially a lowering of rates to stimulate the economy. And of course, that's something we experienced and tried in the 1980s, and for whatever set of reasons, many people believe it worked. Many people can point to the reason that it didn't work. So first, I'm struck that there doesn't seem to be very many new ideas on either side about how to progress. But I was also struck, secondly, that, of course, the implication here is if you don't get growth, but you've shrunk your revenues in your state, and even Republicans from within Kansas were talking about and pushing back against the Republican governor to say, look, we have unfunded needs here, education and other elements here that aren't going to be solved simply by reforming the tax code. But unfortunately, that's really the alternatives that we see in Washington, which is part of this still root dilemma that even if no one wants to talk anymore about short-term deficit control, we still have the same root problem as no one has any agreement over revenues. And
well, I certainly, and I think Bill agrees with me on this, that deficit it's the number one issue facing the country. There certainly is a lot of tension between Obama's base and liberal Democrats, so to speak, who would rather minimize the tension to the deficit. They might not be so aggressive as to say, oh, it's not an important problem, to use the kind of rhetoric that Krugman does. But a lot of Democrats, I think, would like to put it on the back burner and spend some money on infrastructure investments and education and so forth, and programs for the poor. But in the long run, we're hurting ourselves for sure. Now, one other point. I am not an economist, and I do not make predictions about the economy, but I do think that conservatives have laid out somewhat of a reasonable case that if the federal government were on a path to financial stability and we're actually reducing the debt as a percentage of GDP, that would have all sorts of positive effects on businesses and investment. I don't know if it's true, but I think it's a reasonable case. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that responsibility on the deficit and help for the economy are incompatible.
Well, I think that's true, but the argument is, will cutting spending really reduce the deficit and debt, and what needs to be done? Bill started by saying we need growth. We need economic growth. And sort of we have reduced the discretionary domestic spending part of the budget down back to Eisenhower levels. We have core activities of government that are absolutely essential for a modern economy that are being starved these days.
Well, that's true, and there's a real dilemma here. It's not just an arithmetical dilemma, it's a moral dilemma. Spending on things like food stamps is soaring. And I don't know enough about the program to know what percentage of that is absolutely warranted by underlying social and economic circumstances and the percentage that may not be. But I do know this. Young scientists can't get grants for research. That's our future. And it's one thing to borrow money to fund commitments to the present and the past. It's a different thing to borrow money to fund investments in the future. And that's what we're not doing. And unless we can figure out a way of doing a lot more of it, our chances of being on a better path in 5 or 10 years are not very bright, in my opinion.
Where does Grover Norquist's no new tax pledge fit into this? Because what I hear you saying are direct trade-offs in the kind of spending that goes on, but I still see as the highest priority of the Republicans after the deal that was made on the fiscal cliff to avoid any kind of revenue increase. Well, if that's your priority, then your priority isn't necessarily funding important things or reducing the deficit. It's keeping taxes low.
I agree with that. The problem here is that Republicans, I think the idea of no taxes, no tax increases from the very beginning and having pledges and so forth, I think is just a very, very bad idea. And it's unfortunate Republicans fell into it. And it's clear that part of the problem is a reluctance by Republicans to negotiate with the president and to cut deals and an exclusive focus on just cutting spending. That was always a bad idea. On the other hand, Obama and the Democrats, I think, made a mistake of settling for too little when they did increase taxes, because now Republicans are really fired up about, well, we increased taxes, we violated our pledge, by golly, we gave to God and country, and we're not doing it anymore, now you have to cut spending. So I think in a way it was a mistake, and plus it was a mistake. It was a big mistake, I think, for Obama to imply and lead many people in the country to believe that if you tax all those millionaires and billionaires, you're going to get plenty of money, because you're not. In order to really get enough, we do have to cut spending, certainly, but to get enough revenue to do anything serious on the deficit, we're going to have to go into the middle class. So we still face this big problem. I think in many ways we're worse off than we were before. Bill and I both are in a group that we run here at Brookings. It's very bipartisan and has lots of 3 former CBO directors and so forth. And we started out grand bargaining, we're going to have a big deal. And then we started, well, no, we want a medium deal. And I just wrote something about we want a tiny deal. And Bill and I are both working on a tiny deal because
we're moving fast towards no deal.
Yeah, well, yes. So I'm not optimistic about the budget situation. And I can't tell you how much I agree with Bill about the investments. And one last point. The programs that really cost a lot of money and that endanger our future, especially Medicare, but Social Security to some extent, are on automatic pilot. I mean, Americans need to know that their government is totally irresponsible on these entitlements. There's no budget, there's no vote, there's nothing. They just keep going. And as long as that happens, I don't think we have enough tax revenue in the whole country, no matter how deep down into the income distribution you go, to pay for the future of those programs. So we've got to cut spending, Tom, and we've got to do something about entitlements. And the president has not shown leadership, and I guarantee you he will not say anything about entitlements in the State of the Union.
You know, I have a problem with that. Medicare on automatic pilot. I seem to remember that half of the Affordable Care Act was dedicated toward trying to find some way of slowing the rate of increase of healthcare costs. This is not a problem just of government, Ron. This is a problem throughout our society. We spend 17, 18% of GDP on healthcare, and to simply, quote, solve it in the public sector is probably to shift it to the private sector. So that was a big deal. We also approved a global budget in terms of the rate of increase in Medicare and other public health spending programs, and set up a commission with insufficient power to make recommendations to Congress, limited too much in what they can recommend, that would keep us to that budget. That's a start. The president also introduced a number of recommendations of changes, including some additional means testing in Medicare to try to deal with that. So it's not just being ignored. In fact, the irony is that Democrats, because they feel so strongly about the importance of the social safety net of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, and seeing the demographic and health care cost increases, are prepared to make those changes.
I don't disagree with anything you say, and yet, when Social Security increases next year and Medicare increases by 4% or whatever it is, there will be no vote. Congress will not have a budget for Medicare and for Social Security and look at the budget and look at what's projected by CBO to be the growth and say we have to make some changes. That process, which occurs in the rest of the budget, including almost every other program, does not take place. That's my point. I completely agree that what Obama did, and I'm not a person that says, that Obamacare is hopeless and, a horrible idea. And there are good ideas in there, and I even support IPAP. But we need more.
Yeah. Let's look to whether the 113th Congress, following the State of the Union speech, is going to be any more productive than the 112th. Sarah, it was a real bummer. Have the dynamics changed? Ron began by saying he sees cracks in the Republican Party and an openness to operate differently.
Well, there's certainly signs both ways. Certainly the Republicans drawing back from the debt ceiling, using that as a threat to default, and stepping back from that and at least pushing it off to the spring or summer. I think that's a good step. There's also this movement, right? The majority leader is going to AEI today to give a speech, and critics will say he's just repackaging old ideas, but it is at least an effort to move off the dime in terms of all the focus on short-term cuts, to think about different ways of long-term investments. So, and of course, the cracks in immigration reform with the bipartisan group in the Senate counts for quite a lot. Then again, if you look at listen to what Obama said, the president said when he was in Minneapolis yesterday in the -5 degree weather or some balmy temperature like that, I think he said at one point, you can't really count on Congress doing anything until it's done, or something like that. And so the proof is in the pudding here, right? The issue for me is that none of the sort of intrinsic factors that lead to stalemate have really gone. They really haven't gone away. We still have split party control of the House and Senate, which complicates almost everything the president might want to do. We still have high degrees of polarization, at least seemingly, that the two parties both have a partisan incentive and an ideological incentive to disagree with each other. And, of course, we have divided government, which never really helps. And so the conditions are in place to make it very hard to reach agreements. It's possible there may be some issues that there's at least an electoral incentive and some economic incentive for the parties to come together. But I think we're far away from the Senate passing something, say, on immigration reform or gun control. And even if they do...
Or even a budget.
Or even a budget, let alone a budget.
Although they finally have an incentive to do one.
Yes.
I mean, the budget's a sort of... just to finish the thought on, even if the Senate comes up with something, the real dynamic to me is whether or not the House Republicans is there willingness to engage, or they're going to go for the lowest common denominator, possibly go to conference and reach an agreement, or are we facing one of these situations where no deadline, but perhaps facing pressure to agree to a Senate package? They'll do what they did with the fiscal cliff deal and let the majority be rolled. I'm not so sure I think more likely the House Republicans will come out with sort of a bare minimum package of what they're willing to agree to. But I don't know that we know that they're really there.
Though, on immigration, if that were true, that would be great. Because what I think really has held up immigration is that we don't have good solutions on securing our borders, or what we're going to do with 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country right now. And Republicans have been ferocious about that. If there were to pass a bill on what we agree on, that would have all kinds of, as you mentioned in the beginning, positive effects on the American economy, and allow people to enter who have higher education, try to attract more students and let them stay, make an easy path to citizenship for people who come in here for education. I mean, there are a number of things that we could do that really would be very helpful to the economy that other countries have done. And so if we could get a partial bill and pass what you agree on, that would be real progress. I'm not predicting what will happen, but it would.
Isn't the reality, Bill, though, that, to get legislation through in this political environment, if anything is going to happen, it's probably going to involve a overwhelming majority of Democrats and some Republicans in the Senate and then in the House. And the question is, I think Republicans in the Senate are willing to do that. They're ready to govern. They're tired of just pure opposition party. But it's much tougher for Republicans in the House to go off on their own, sign a discharge petition. I don't see that happening. So what's the way out of this?
Well, my reading of American political history is that when strong majorities of the American people make up their mind that something needs to be done in a particular sector of policy, it tends to happen. The force of public sentiment is typically strong enough to wear away at the walls and the sand berms that our constitutional processes establish to slow down progress. And we have certainly reached that point with regard to a piece of the gun agenda having to do with background checks, and I'm reasonably confident that's going to happen. And I think we're on the verge of reaching that with regard to at least a piece of the immigration agenda. So I think that in the face not just of a bare majority, but a large majority of the American people, House Republicans will find a way of getting to yes. When sentiment is much more closely as well as deeply divided, then I don't think much is going to happen.
Well, this has been fun. We focused on domestic policy to the exclusion of foreign policy, but that partly reflects a new reality that's out there, a broad agreement that for us to have a really effective foreign policy, we have to get our affairs at home straightened out, and I suspect that will be.
We won't be having any foreign policy for a while. Then I'm afraid.
Well, some is inevitable, right? Foreign policy issues have a way of intruding on every president's agenda, and I suspect this will be no exception. Bill, thank you.
My pleasure.
And Ron Haskins, thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Sarah Binder?
Sure, thanks for including me.
This is Tom Mann. It's been a pleasure.
This Brookings Institution podcast was posted on February 4, 2013. For more information, visit brookings.edu.